Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name's Chelsea Biggs. I'm the Chief of Staff at the Illinois Environmental Council. We're so happy to bring together this esteemed group of our colleagues to talk about addressing shoreline erosion and flooding in Illinois. Before we jump into the meat of the conversation, I do want to just go over a little bit of who we are at IEC and what we do, and then I'll turn it over to the people who you're very eager to hear from today. So the Illinois Environmental Council has been around since 1975. Our goal is to build power for people in the environment by supporting and leading in policy that addresses, everything from, actually, can just go to the next slide. Everything from sustainable agriculture and conservation, clean energy, equitable transportation, clean water, and zero waste. We have programs and policy staff that specialize in all of these areas. Our goal is to build coalition with organizations doing environmental work around the state of Illinois, provide legislator education so those that are in decision-making roles around the state understand the issues that we're facing in the environment, solutions that we know exist, and feel connected to those issues. We then do policy advocacy to support our members and to support the state of Illinois at large. So IEC's affiliates, we represent more than 150 organizations around the state that focus in all of those issue areas that we touched on. Our geographic scope is wide, so our affiliates can be national organizations with local chapters, regional organizations, community-based organizations, city-focused, civic institutions. The size of those organizations vary widely. We have some volunteer-based organizations that are members of IEC. We have, some of the big organization names that you know and love that are members of IEC as well. So we're very proud of the breadth and depth of the voices that we have at the table. Our affiliates, we operate with our affiliates in mostly like a traditional trade association way. We write legislation based on what their needs are. We pass those bills. We provide office resources, both in Springfield and Chicago. We do bring together our policy staff, one of which you'll hear from today, Ayanna, and we connect them with our affiliates so that we have regular means of communication and can hear the issues they're facing or successes that they're experiencing. And our affiliates really lead in setting our policy agenda year over year, which I think is potentially the most impactful way that they engage with us here at IEC. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ayanna Simba, IEC's lead in our water issues. Truly an amazing member of our team that's been around for quite a while and has led in some major successes in the environmental movement. So Ayanna, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panel.
Yes, thank you, Chelsea. Hi, everyone. Ayanna Simba, City Programs Director with IEC. As Chelsea said, I've done a lot of water work in the past years, and I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of these folks on the panel. And so I'm really excited for our panelists today. And so I'm going to try to get through these bios really quick, but we have people with a long history and a lot of experience in the shoreline and erosion. So I'll first start off with Alderwoman Maria Hadden. She is the first Black queer woman elected to the Chicago City Council, a servant leader with a background in community organizing and participatory democracy. Maria has become an independent progressive champion for the people in City Council who advocates not just for her ward, but communities across Chicago. Before becoming Alderwoman, Maria Hadden was the executive director of City Our Voice, a nonprofit organization she founded to enable communities and local governments across the country to redesign democracy for more empowered and equitable participation. Additionally, she's a founding board member of the Participatory Budget Project. Maria is a lifelong environmentalist. Currently, she serves as she currently serves as the chair of Chicago's Committee on Environmental and Energy Protection, where she has led the charge for policies like decarbonizing buildings, alleviating flooding in Chicago, equitable zoning practices, and the reestablishment of the Department of Environment. Moving on to our second panelist, Mike Padilla. As a native of Illinois, Mr. Padilla began his career with the Army Corps in 1989 as a civil engineering student trainee in the Chicago District Civil Design section while completing studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago in 1991. In 1993, he accepted a permanent position as civil engineer in the Chicago District's Design Branch Civil Section. And between 2000 and 2008, Mr. Padilla worked for the Seattle District Programs and Project Management Branch, serving as project manager position for several significant ecosystem restoration and hydropower construction projects, and became the Seattle District's Chief of Civil Projects Section, serving 2 years before returning to the Chicago District's Project Management Division, where he currently serves. Additionally, in 2008, he served as a project program manager in Afghanistan, managing the roads, counter-narcotics, border management support for others in the USAID program. Most recently, Mr. Padilla completed the Westminster Bubbly Creek feasibility study, resulting in the chief's report and congressional authorization for the projects. In January 2023, Mr. Padilla was selected as the project manager for the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Mega Study at the GS14 level. Our third panelist, Commissioner Precious Brady-Davis, was appointed to the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago by Governor Pritzker in July of 2023. She is the first openly Black trans woman appointed to public office in Cook County history and the first to serve on the Water Reclamation District in the United States. Commissioner Brady-Davis is a lifelong social justice advocate, communications professional, environmentalist, author of the memoir I Have Always Been Me, and cares passionately about reaching the marginalized through her extensive career in nonprofit management and public speaking. For 6 years, she served as the Associate Regional Communications Director at Sierra Club, leading campaigns and that champion renewable energy, hold corporate polluters accountable, and fight climate change. She started her professional career serving as the Youth Outreach Coordinator at the Center on Halsted, where she coordinated youth programming surrounding HIV prevention, transgender advocacy, and LGBTQ leadership development. Commissioner Precious Brady-Davis also previously served as Assistant Director of Diversity Recruitment Initiatives at Columbia College, where she graduated with a degree in interdisciplinary studies. Commissioner Brady-Davis believes strongly in protecting the primary source of drinking water, Lake Michigan, and is invested in advancing green infrastructure to improve community resilience and prevent flooding across Cook County. Finally, our final panelist, Ted Haffner, is currently the chair of the Chicago Wilderness Alliance Taking Climate Action Committee. Trained as a landscape architect, Ted is curious about the intersections of functional landscape ecology, community resilience, and climate solutions and strategies. Blending thoughtful approaches to design and strategic thinking, Ted works to analyze and connect the natural world to the built environment through the integration of innovative and contextually based best management practices, policies, and conservation ideology. A former employee of Open Lands, Ted held dual roles as landscape architect and climate fellow, where he served as the owner's representation for Open Lands, construction projects, and headed climate change strategy implementation that focused on community resilience and nature-based solutions to mitigate climate change impacts such as heat and flooding. Prior to working at Open Lands, Ted served as the senior associate and project manager with Terry Gwynn Design Associates, a landscape architecture firm specializing in public and institutional landscape design. So that was a lot. We have, again, an amazing panel, and I'm going to kick us off right into the first round of questions. Again, a reminder for folks that we will have Q&A time at the end. But I first just want to start off for everyone on the panel. How have you been personally impacted by flooding or shoreline erosion? And did you expect your professional life to be so impacted by these issues? And maybe we'll go with Mr. Padilla first. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I have been personally impacted by flooding in Chicago mainly. A while back, actually, it's probably 15 or 20 years ago, there was a major storm, on the lake, and it caused flooding on Lakeshore Drive, which closed Lakeshore Drive down. I wasn't actually on Lakeshore Drive, but I was very nearby, and it basically, caused traffic, huge traffic delays and a big snarl. And the weather wasn't very good, as you know, so it really caused problems. And another situation that happened to me was, the city of Chicago has combined sewers, so the stormwater and then wastewater. And the stormwater So it works just fine when it doesn't rain very heavily, but when it does rain, then there used to be lots of combined sewer overflows and sewer backups. And I had a huge vinyl record collection that was very, very, very important to me, but it got flooded out and destroyed essentially. So that's very personal to me. Thank goodness our partnership, the Corps of Engineers and MWRD, we were able to build the McCook Reservoir and Thornton Reservoirs. That has gone a long way to solve those problems. So yes, I've had issues definitely with flooding. And then did I ever think that my professional career would be tied into flooding? I would say yes, because I work for the Corps of Engineers, and that's one of our, ever since I was a student, as you mentioned. And one of our main missions is flood risk management. So I did realize that I would be involved in that, and I've had a very fruitful career, helping people, hopefully continuing to help people with dealing with issues with flooding.
Thank you. Maybe we'll pass it to Alderwoman Hadden.
I'm happy to be here and to be on this panel with such great folks. So hello, everybody. So the 49th Ward largely encompasses the Rogers Park community. Being the kind of furthest northeast ward in the city, that also means that we're right along the lake. So I've lived here myself for 20 plus years. And I also, for the last 14, I live in a garden apartment. So the 49th Ward is marked by a lot of multi-unit buildings, and we have a lot of homes that are at that kind of garden level or even basement level. We do have some basement apartments. And so being right along the lake, being kind of within this very sandy land and dealing with especially the increased precipitation that we've been seeing. Flooding is always an issue for our community. So especially last year, I know with some of those torrential rains, I definitely, for the first time, actually in the 14 years that I've lived in this apartment, had water come into my home just because we had so much standing water on the street from the flooding. I'll say that shoreline erosion has also been seen. We've had huge impacts along the 49th Ward with shoreline erosion, most notably or recently, I guess I'll say, during that 2019-2020 winter storm season, where we were losing a 1 to 2 feet of shoreline with each storm event, resulting in real threats to people's homes, and ultimately the loss of 3 of our northernmost beaches for community use. So the need for kind of shoreline protection, emergency kind of riprap and boulders and things kind of being put in. And so some pretty dramatic and immediate kind of threats to people's homes, safety and infrastructure. We've seen it all in a very short period of time. Oh, and did I think that this would come into play in my professional life? No. No is the short answer. Representing a shoreline community, certainly, these were some issues, but it's really only been in these last few years where I've seen I think we've all experienced such dramatic climate-related threats and changes. So, surprise.
Thank you, Alderwoman. Commissioner, I see you're already unmuted.
I too want to thank everyone on this panel for being here. So glad to join such a group of esteemed individuals. And from a very young age, I was impacted by flooding. I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska. Our backyard butted a ravine that often flooded. And so when I would play in my backyard as a child, it would often be muddy. There would often be puddles, and the ground would be seeping wet. And so that was something that I understood from a very young age, the plight of environmental disaster. And then last summer, when we had that once in 100-year storm, I too live on the shore in Hyde Park. I'm a Hyde Parker, and I live in a condo. And even in a condo, my balcony flooded. I live 17 floors up, and the amount of water that came from that storm seeped onto my beautiful wood floor at my home. And I woke up to just like a pool of water that was just seeping on my beautiful wood floor. And so, as a Hyde Parker, like I said, I too understand the deep plight of shoreline erosion. I recently toured Promontory Point, and I met with the Promontory Point Conservancy. And I saw right there where you see the limestone revet is literally plunging into the water. Not all of it, but less than 25% of it has literally has it's seeped into the water there, and it would be great to see that limestone preserved. But we see with this beautiful park that we have in Hyde Park of how it's just is eroding the shore and it's increasing flooding. So I think it's important that we have this conversation and that we mitigate it as much as possible. And so I would say, like this is something that I expected as someone who worked for the Sierra Club for 6 years, whose life was, committed to mitigating climate change. Flooding is a symptom of climate change. And so it's one of the reasons why I think we need to address climate change so much, right? Because when we think of who is disproportionately impacted by climate change, who is getting the resources to be relieved from climate change, whether it's the insurance, whether it's the infrastructure. So I would say, yeah, this feels about right. My whole life has been dedicated to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So whether that's the LGBTQ community, whether that's environmental justice, I would say yes.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm also a Hyde Parker, and I don't live quite so close to the shore, but definitely, experience the storms that we get down in Hyde Park. And yeah, it's definitely I wouldn't say even a love-hate, but it's definitely sometimes not the best to be that close to the lake. And then Ted.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity. Welcome, everybody. I guess personally, in like my personal life, I really haven't been impacted by flooding as much as some of my friends who live up in Rogers Park, which Alderperson Hadden addressed, and down in Hyde Park, I have friends there too that have been impacted by flooding. But other than sort of, the underpass flooding that we see when you're driving around and things like that, personally, I have not really been impacted more than anybody else. Professionally is a different story. As a landscape architect, we worked on the Thornton project that Mike Padilla referenced. That's a really cool deep tunnel project that takes a lot of money and a lot of time, right? Also worked on the rehabilitation for Navy Pier, and that was problematic because that happened before the lake levels rose. But what we did there was we essentially cut holes in the pier and made boxes to plant the trees in. And we had to keep those boxes out of the mean high level watermark. And that got really hard to do when the lake went up and impacted those boxes where those trees live under the pier pavement. Open Lands Lakeshore Preserve, I managed that portion of property up in at the former Fort Sheridan. That is a very soft shoreline. There's nothing to protect it. We lost more than 2 feet during those high lake levels 3 years ago. We probably lost 4 or 5 feet and saw whole portions of our bluff crack and subside, and 3 and 4 foot changes in elevation about 100 feet back from the shoreline. Space to Grow, also an open lands project and a partnership between Chicago Department of Water, Water Reclamation District, and the Healthy Schools Campaign, and the Department of Education, right? Public schools. We would take as much asphalt as we could in flood-prone neighborhoods, take it away, put storage in the ground, and use it to relieve neighborhood flooding. When I left, there was no real hard data to show that that worked, but there was a lot of anecdotal data of people that lived adjacent to the schools. Their basements were no longer flooding. So those are a lot of the professional ways that I've been impacted by flooding, and it's more than I would like. But it certainly keeps me in business, and it certainly presents a lot of challenges in terms of thinking about hard, medium, hard, and soft edges and how you protect those natural resources for multiple uses, right? Recreation, transportation, protection, infrastructure, all that stuff. So that is some of how I've been impacted by high water and flooding. And we do know it's getting worse because data indicates that in northeastern Illinois, our rain level, precipitation level is going way up to the tune of about an inch more of water in precipitation form a year. So.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you all for answering that first question. I have a couple more, and these are going to be a little bit more pointed. So this one is specifically for Alder Hadden and Mike Padilla. How are the Army Corps of Engineers and the City of Chicago working together to address shoreline erosion? And do you have a status update of the Chicago Shoreline Protection Project? And kind of another part of the question, do you anticipate more federal support for shoreline erosion?
I could probably go first, Alderwoman Hadden, because just some specifics. So to address flooding on the shoreline and flooding and erosion, essentially, the Corps of Engineers, in partnership with the City of Chicago Department of Transportation and the Chicago Park District, in the 1990s, Congress authorized the Chicago Shoreline Project. That project is authorized to build 24 segments all along both north and south of the shoreline, over 9 miles of shoreline in the city of Chicago, to address the problem. And of those 24 segments, 22 have already been built, and the remaining ones are Morgan Shoal and Promontory Point. And you mentioned Promontory Point was mentioned earlier, and those two are ongoing, and there's been funding for Morgan Shoal, but also need funding for Promontory Point. And funding is tight, as everybody knows. We're still kind of working on that from the federal standpoint. In fact, the cost share for those last two segments, Promontory Point and Morgan Shoal, was changed by law from Congress so that the Corps of Engineers has to pay a significantly larger portion of the cost share for those two projects, basically because they realize that the plan that the city wants to do has to work with the community and do certain things, whereas the plan the Corps was originally going to do just was not supportable. And so the lower cost of our plan was not really feasible. So we needed to cost share the other plans. And actually, the Promontory plan is still in development. In addition to the Chicago Shoreline Project, Congress asked the Corps to reevaluate our project for the shoreline because of the changes that have occurred in the 30 years since the 90s, and also since the early 90s, and also because of the climate change, and also the what happens from climate change, like the high water levels we saw in 2020 and things like that. And so we've engaged and got funded on the Chicago Shoreline General Reevaluation Study, which we're just starting to get started on now. We were beginning that study, and we wanted to evaluate some new things associated with that. So we're a little bit in hiatus right now to make sure that we can get approval for additional funding. The original study was approved for $3 million to be cost shared between the Park District, the city, and the Corps. But we have to actually see a need for a little bit more than that. So we're actually working on getting additional funding. The last thing I wanted to mention that we're working on, the Corps of Engineers in partnership with the 8 Great Lakes states, as you mentioned in doing my bio there, we've started the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study. That study is to look at vulnerabilities across all of the Great Lakes, including Illinois. And furthermore, we're going to do it with an eye towards climate change. And so we're actually doing a very sophisticated model right now that would model, climate change. What's going to happen to water levels in the future, and what's going to happen to ice conditions that people probably don't realize as much, that the ice actually protects the coastline from erosion during big storms, and it's starting to go away. And so we're actually engaged with, it's a multi-agency effort, including NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmosphere Administration, USGS, and also the 8 Great Lakes states, and also academia. And so we're all partnering to find a way to be more resilient, understand the vulnerabilities in the face of climate. And so the model that we're using to model how the climate is going to change will be used in our study. So those are the things we're doing. A lot of great things going on, a lot of smart people looking at it. And of course, we need community input and support to do this properly.
And I'll say from the city side, in this, one of the first meetings that I held when after I was sworn in, was in my office, and it was in response to the additional, like, to the threats to our shoreline. So I was sworn in May 20th, 2019. And that summer, it was kind of top of my mind that we'd already gone through a pretty rough winter season with high Lake Michigan levels. We'd already been seeing shoreline erosion, flooding, and it was only going to be worse in the coming year. And we knew it was going to be worse because we knew Lake Michigan levels were already higher. And it was the park district, it was, the city's Department of Transportation, it was the state's Department of Natural Resources. It was the Army Corps, but it was the wrong Army Corps office, Mike. Because I was new. We just reached out to like Chicago Army Corps. It wasn't the appropriate Army Corps office, but as a new elected official in Chicago City Council, representing a lakefront community at risk of significant damage, I sat down with this group in the room, and I'm like, okay, so we all know what's happening. You all know better than me. We've been through this. Some of it's with predictable cycles of lake levels. Some of it's different and complicated by our storm patterns. What's happening? And I think that's where a lot of our constituents are kind of start as well, assuming that there's some large coordinated effort at multiple levels of government to not just respond to crises, but kind of plan for the future. And unfortunately, it doesn't quite work that way. So thankfully, of course, folks from the park district and the city were kind of already in the process of writing, kind of the beginning of their quest to Mike's point, what eventually was like the $3 million grant that, we were awarded in order for them to kind of begin this study, which is much needed. But in the process of that first meeting, to being able to stand up there with, the Army Corps, the mayor, and some of our Illinois delegation that, helped to make sure this study could be funded. I learned about that 1994 study, and it's wild to me that, a study was done 30 years ago to look at, and it determined what were the 8 most vital miles of the city of Chicago. And I had a chance to read that report. It took a lot to get my hands on a copy through City of Chicago channels. And part of the determination in the 90s, right? So like I was like in elementary school or whatever. In the 90s, part of that determination looked at kind of like the economic value, and even looked at demographics of like percent of people of certain races, and factored into like how they were going to prioritize, which parts of our shoreline were worth prioritizing and having protection for. And it's wild to look at, how much thinking has changed, and determination has changed over time. And I know looking at how this study is being conducted now, and the fact that we get to have real conversations about not just putting more concrete, right? Looking at sustainable solutions, I think just shows like in a relatively short period of time, like how much we're seeing change and how we're like both the science of how we're thinking about our shoreline, but also the government and the bureaucracy of how this work gets done. I will say that while grateful that, you know, the kind of final 8 miles of shoreline are finally being considered in this reevaluation, certainly they should have been part of the evaluation to begin with. But I think, and some of the things that Mike shared also point to um, the dire need that we have for our federal government to actually put more resources towards the really vital work that the Army Corps does for us, right? Especially with rapidly changing conditions. So maybe, you know, we could take 30 years ago to conduct a whole construction project of significance. But we're already looking at circumstances, climate and conditions changing like rapidly before our eyes. And that poses all kinds of challenges for them to be able to do like real solid evaluations and propose plans for us that are going to work and still be, you know, still do the job that we need them to do for the next 20, 30, or 40 years. So just to say, the work that they do is so important. And I think, you know, at the city level, one of the things that myself and some of my colleagues want to do is really try and bring more power to our city, right, through our Department of Environment, to also advocate with our kind of Illinois delegation. But like, we need more funds, more federal dollars, and more authority, I think, given in that space to groups like the Army Corps for them to really meet the challenges that we're facing, right? The way we've funded this in the past, the tools that we've given them in the past, and the way that cities have addressed this in the past isn't going to cut it for the future.
Thank you both for the update, because I've done a lot of Googling and I was like, what are the different projects? Thank you, Mike, so much for explaining the difference between like the coastal resiliency study, the shoreline erosion project, and then I'm forgetting the name of the other one, but the other federal evaluation, because I've been very confused. So I appreciate that. And I thank you, Alderman Hadden, for sort of explaining from the city's portion what you all are focused on. The next question I have is for Alderwoman Hadden and Commissioner Precious Brady-Davis. What are you and your colleagues, or since you all are both in different separate bodies of government, what are you and your colleagues in your body of government doing to address flooding? Do either of you plan to host a public hearing anytime soon on the issue?
If I can start, Commissioner, because this is a shorter answer from me. We've had public hearings on flooding in Chicago, so definitely, and I think we're going to need to have more. So when flooding happens, it's such an acute emergency experience for our communities that a lot of course, the city's attention rightfully turns to emergency response. We still have people from the flooding that happened on the west side last year who are dealing with mold and all the after impacts, right, of significant flooding. And, you know, the emergency response is necessary. And we have to have these conversations to get a bit more proactive on our planning. So we have held in the committee actually hearings on flooding. You know, proposed a resolution to put a referendum question on the ballot, actually asking Chicagoans their thoughts on emergency or flood mitigation planning that the city should do. We didn't move forward with that, but it's a problem that's not going away anytime soon. And actually, you know, the commissioner will have some things to say, but I think that there's some great things that our water reclamation district is doing in some of their non-city of Chicago coverage areas that are also some things that I think the city would be smart to support and bring into some of our neighborhoods most at risk for flooding. And you know, Open Lands, other groups have met with us to help give us some great ideas on that.
Thank you, Alderwoman. We as an agency, we are the agency tasked with addressing countywide flooding. We serve 129 municipalities across the county. We literally were built by building the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, reversing the course of the Chicago River, providing a source of drainage for the region. And I was appointed on July 5th last year, literally 2 days after those intense storms happened. And so I got right to work. And let me tell you, I was in Cicero, I was on the west side of Chicago. And let me tell you the pain of seeing a basement flooded, of a small business owner, a Black woman, who this is her livelihood, of walking through her basement and seeing the daycare flooded waist high was absolutely devastating to me. And one of the things that I heard right away when I was talking to residents across the county is they didn't know who to call. Who should we call? What does the MWRD do? And so one of the first things that I did was create a resource of who to call. Right? Because some of the things don't happen at the county level, they happen at the municipal level. Like such as Chicago, Chicago is the first level when you need something when it comes to flooding. You should call the city of Chicago first, and then you should call the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District after. And so I advocated quickly for Governor Pritzker to, create a disaster declaration. That also followed by us advocating for members of Congress to advocate for a federal disaster declaration after that, because Alderwoman Hadden said it exactly. What folks need most is resources when this flooding is happening. One of the other things that I heard the alderman talk about was this collaboration, right? Of us creating a plan. And I do think that there needs to be more intergovernmental collaboration, right? Because this is a county-wide issue. And so us as the district, we champion stormwater projects. We champion green infrastructure. We have over 240 green infrastructure projects. We do offer grants to local municipalities. We just issued our spring grants. We also offer a rain bail program where folks can disconnect their downspout, saving the pressure in terms of the amount of water that goes into our sewers, which also lessens the flooding. We also work with our watershed planning councils. We get local input from folks who are actually experiencing the flooding in these communities. So I think it's important that those folks are a part of the planning of the infrastructure in their communities. We also issue overflow action alerts. So we ask folks on days when it's raining, we ask for them to be mindful of their water use, whether that is them running their dishwasher or whether that's taking a long shower. So we ask folks to lessen their water use so we can prevent those combined sewer overflows, which actually cause the flooding. We also have our tunnel and our reservoir program, Thornton McCook, that holds 11 billion gallons of water in terms of where does that water go? And so I think that we are taking an innovative approach. That's something that I always say in this work, that the MWRD has always been on the forefront of addressing this issue. What happened at the turn of the century when they reversed the Chicago River, it was gutsy. It was absolutely gutsy with what they did to preserve the source of our drinking water, Lake Michigan, and to mitigate flooding. And I think what the storms last summer taught us, that we need to take a more innovative approach, right? Because climate change is here. We're going to continue to see increasingly heavier storms. And so I think it's about how do we continue to advance these stormwater programs? How do we advance permeable pavement through gray and green infrastructure?
Thank you, Alderwoman and Commissioner. Commissioner, I might go as far as to ask if you know there's any upcoming hearings on flooding anytime soon that MWRD will have.
Flooding is something that it's a continuous conversation, obviously, here at the district. just our last board meeting, we had a conversation around our green infrastructure projects. And so it is continuing. It is a conversation that I would like to see continue. Like I said, it's something that I've talked to the Alderwoman about. It's something that I've talked to folks in Springfield about. So something that I'm working on is how can we create an intergovernmental task force specifically to talk about flooding, also to come up with a plan. Like, what is our plan to tackle these increasingly heavier storms? We also saw last year when we saw the largest climate bill passed in Congress. So it's something that President Biden is taking attention to. So I know the Alderwoman talked about that, the Climate and Reduction Act. We talked about that, the Alderwoman talked about the funding. So I think we need to bring that funding. So in terms of the question that you asked at hand, yes. So something in the future, in the works, but like I said, I would like to see an intergovernmental task force come together to talk about how we mitigate flooding.
Thank you, Commissioner. And IEC, we would definitely love to see an intergovernmental connection beyond this panel, because we're kind of doing that today, right? Anyways, let me move on to the final question that I have, and then we will kick it over to the audience to ask whatever you want. So for Ted, while great infrastructure is certainly needed to prevent and mitigate shoreline erosion and flooding, so I think the Alderwoman that spoke to sort of like great infrastructure being like, you know, those fiscal limestone and concrete barriers and things to shoreline erosion. And then on the flooding end, just installing more sewer pipes and drains, et cetera, but also thinking about green infrastructure. So could you speak to more nature-based solutions to alleviate flooding and/or shoreline erosion? And what are some barriers to implementing more nature-based solutions?
Thank you. You know, those are great questions. In terms of how we move forward and the types of infrastructure that we have gray infrastructure, right? That's old pipes. We know that. We know how to measure that stuff pretty well. We have green infrastructure on the other end. That's mostly nature solutions, soft edges, right? That kind of stuff. And then we have a hybrid in between. The challenges are many right now. One is we don't really know how nature behaves, especially when we see this acceleration of change in our environment, right? I think it was Mike earlier that referenced we don't get ice anymore in the winter, right? That ice is a form of infrastructure, if you will, that used to historically protect our soft coasts, right? Where we didn't have the hard infrastructure. We can't have that anymore. Or we can't have that reliably anymore. So we really need to think about how all these systems interact, built and non-built. And then I think we need to come up with holistic solutions to address them. For instance, one of the biggest problems with flooding in our area actually came not from the built environment, but from policy considerations that were present from 1930 and beyond in the form of redlining. There are studies all across the nation that look at 415 or 20 cities that show that canopy cover for urban forests in our communities is based on redlining, and that policy that is tied to housing and loans is really discriminatory, but it's based on risk and liability, right? Problems galore. So you have communities that are poor that don't have canopy cover, they have increased temperatures, they have increased flooding, right? That's a policy issue that we need to think about. That intersects with our conversation today, but not many people know that. There are 5 other examples like that I could bring up that we don't have time for. We need to think holistically about how all of this intersects in addition to how nature and hard infrastructure intersect, which we don't really understand very well. So I understand the need for 10-year studies because they really do inform things. Unfortunately, we don't have the time for that right now. And that's the challenge. So we have to come together to learn from each other, both impacts and solutions in place-based conditions that are going to differ, maybe even block by block sometimes. And that adds huge layers of complexity. So we need systems, we need thought, we need trial and error, we need informed trial and error. We need our collective memory issues from 30 years ago and that study that sat on a shelf not to happen again, because we don't have that time. We need to address our liability issues so that the city of Chicago can release flood maps to inform citizenry instead of keeping them hidden because it is a liability issue, right? So all of these things are intersecting in the gray and the green, and we need to figure it out. I'm not sure I answered that question as well as I could have, but I think conversations like this that lead to decision makers and impacts throughout our society are really important and needed at a scale that is even greater in terms of temporal scale. So shorter, quicker turnarounds, shorter, quicker pilot projects, proof of concept type stuff, and then decisions, more informed long-term decisions from there. That's what I got. That's my opinion. It's not anybody else's. But you know, we all face these problems in real time, and the complexities of our society exacerbate this a lot of times.
No, I mean, honestly, thank you, Ted, for that response. I think that's, to me, that was a lot more interesting. The typical response is, oh, we can't measure the outcomes of these. You know, it's usually that kind of thing, but like, it really is a lot of the like policy and governmental barriers that make up the biggest.
But the other point, the other answer to that question is, when I was a designer, we would propose stuff all the time, and regulatorily we couldn't get it through because the agencies didn't understand what we were proposing and if it would work, so they didn't want to permit it. And I'm talking about rain gardens, right? We're starting to get that sorted out in terms of how much those can hold and contain in the rate and flow, but there's still issues like that we need to solve, and our permit issues, so we can't even install them no matter how good our thinking is and how good our intentions are.
Thank you, Ted. And thank you others on the panelists for answering my questions. I appreciate that. I'm now going to open it up to the audience. Please add your questions into the chat, just so we don't have folks randomly popping on and off of mute. So I did see the question about the nuclear along the lake. I think Gary might have responded to that, and so I think there might be an answer there. Also, I think it's a little bit beyond the topic of this panel, given that most of it is outside of the Chicagoland area and outside of Illinois. With that, I will move forward on to Malia's question that's in the chat, that the panelists have recognized that some Chicago communities, those on the south and west side, suffer disproportionately from flooding and have for years. DWM recently named its Southside Area 4 solution as part of its contribution to the city's EJ action plan. And MWRD has referenced that it has plans for Southside flooding relief as well. Can the panelists describe what plans the city and MWRD have for these communities and how these pieces fit together? That's coming from Malia.
So we currently have a project happening, the Robbins Heritage Park and Midlothian Creek Restoration Project, Addison Creek Reservoir in the western suburbs, the channel improvements there. So it's something that I think that we as commissioners are taking notice of. How can we partner with these municipalities? How can we encourage them to apply for our green infrastructure programs? So I think it's about the collaboration with the local municipalities. Like I said, also the watershed planning councils. How can we work to plan with these local communities? What do they want in these communities, right? Sometimes MWRD, we might be proposing a project that's needed and they don't want it there, right? So how do we, gather the buy-in for those communities? Because historically, right, folks come in those communities and they tell them what to do. So it's really about partnering with folks on the ground to effectively manage stormwater projects. But some of it is education, right? Conversations like this. It's the resources that we have, something that I was talking about earlier. It's our access to the rain barrels, right? How do we teach folks to disconnect their downspouts? How do we talk about plants, right? The green infrastructure that can absorb water. So some of it is about the outreach and the education.
And I would add, it also comes down to the funding. So the city definitely looks at results of these reports and right, like these areas, and that is how these departments prioritize where they're going to make investments. One of the problems on why we end up maybe having, neighborhoods, communities, constituents that are continually plagued with this comes down to, we know it's an issue. We know even the solutions we want to build to fix it, we don't have the money. And so that's where I think, there's the education piece, right? I think the city needs to do better about informing and educating a lot of our constituents um, about, sorry, I'm getting some background noise. I don't know if you guys heard that. Oh, thanks, Mike. Educating the constituencies so that you guys can also advocate for yourselves, because a lot of times that advocacy isn't necessarily like to the city or even the reclamation district. Sometimes it's, we need your help pushing, right, our federal partners or our state partners. A lot of times it's our federal partners, right, for more of these dollars to come our way so that we can implement these large scale projects that can address like these like really large issues that are facing whole communities.
Hey, I would like to mention that recently policy has changed. The question is about the disproportionate flooding and things in certain areas. So the policy used to be really economical for the Corps of Engineers when we were trying to analyze what project should we build to solve this certain flooding problem. And the policy used to be very economical. In other words, whatever project had the most net benefits, that means the benefits minus the costs. And let's face it, a lot of the benefits were, hey, we're stopping this really expensive neighborhood from getting flooded, and that means the economics for this plan is very high. Whereas saving this community over here from flooding, the economics aren't that great, and so let's pick this plan. And that's in a nutshell kind of the way things used to be done. More recently, the Biden administration and Congress has been working towards, and actually the Chicago Shoreline General Reevaluation Study that we're doing will look beyond that. So we're starting to be able to incorporate other factors in selecting the plan, the selecting a plan. So things such as environmental and social considerations and other things other than just plain economics can now be evaluated and brought in. And so it's going to be like a trade-off analysis where it's not just the bottom line dollar, that those other factors will be in. So that's a good thing.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Got a few more minutes. Renee Patton from the Edgewater Environmental Coalition asked, would anyone on the panel be interested, or in the anyone on the panel or in the audience be interested in building a Lakefront Coalition working group that brings together all different types of stakeholders to keep moving on these issues?
If I could add, so I actually introduced an ordinance last month to create a Lakeshore Advisory Board, similar to what we've seen with our Urban Forestry Advisory Board. So the structure would ideally mirror, right, where we would have relevant department representatives from the city, relevant other government bodies, but also community organizations and partners, right, who are all kind of working together so that we could talk about our lakefront, our shoreline, and plan. So the Urban Forestry Advisory Board is really only been meeting for a few quarters, but we're already seeing good work come out of that model. So introduced that legislation last month and hope to move it forward over the next couple of months.
Ayana, there used to be a group that was out of the IDNR coastal office that got together to look at sand management along the Illinois shoreline. That group met twice a year. Once I left Open Lands, I sort of couldn't participate anymore, but I don't think that group exists anymore. Or if it does, it's sort of been on hiatus. But that was a really good group because it brought together the core, permit folks, legislators, and sort of nonprofits, environmental groups to look at really big issues that we haven't addressed here. And those are things like sand management, which is really hard to permit renourishment because of environmental considerations. Also, navigation trumps everything along the shoreline. So we haven't addressed that at all today, but that's a really powerful interest. And working harbors get dredged and have a whole lot of different rules that interrupt our coastline and sort of drift movement from north to south. But that's a great group. And if we could get that going again, I think that would talk about this as a regional problem, because what we're seeing right now is localized, independent, one-off, separate, projects by a mile, quarter mile. They almost do more damage than they do provide solutions. So I would recommend that group get going, and I hope the legislation we just heard about does wonders, because that tree board is great, and it took a while, but that is a good model and pilot project for us to follow.
I was on mute. Okay, apparently it's still alive. Cody Askew, he put his information in the chat, but that working group is still living on. And they have a monthly meeting. I think this will probably be the final question. This is coming from, where is the person they said something about Wilmette? Yes, Mark. Homeowners in Wilmette and Philadelphia are reimbursed for rain garden and permeable pavement installation. When will MWRD begin to reimburse?
I think that is a larger conversation. Reimbursement isn't something that we do as a government agency. I think for me, something that I would like to see in the future in terms of reimbursement is, how do folks get assistance in real time who are experiencing the flooding, right? Because currently there is no emergency fund. So let's say your basement floods right away, there is no immediate assistance, right? You have to navigate the insurance claim process to get help. And often you're not even recovering the full measure of the damage. And so that's not something that we currently do. Folks are welcome to come testify if you have ideas. We have our board meeting the first and third Thursday of every month. So please come and make public comment. I am one of 9 commissioners on our board, and we're always glad to hear public input and ideas.
Well, we are at about time. I just want to say thank you to all the panelists who were able to join. I know it was a very quick turnaround for some folks because I was reaching out a few weeks ago. So I really appreciate you all for showing up and being here. The chat is saved and the recording will be saved as well. So if folks have more questions, they can always go back to the recordings. And many of the folks here on this panel are public elected officials or public officials, so you can find their information as well. So thanks all again. Thank you, panelists, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of the afternoon.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.